Vigil at the Vatican.
The faithful gather in St. Peter's Square to mourn the death of a pope.
From CBS News headquarters in New York, this is the CBS Evening News.
Good evening, I'm John Dickerson.
I'm Maurice Dubois.
For the first time in 12 years, the chair of St. Peter is vacant.
Sede vacante is the Latin term for this period between the death of a pope and the election of his successor.
Pope Francis, spiritual leader of the world's nearly 1.5 billion Catholics, died this morning of a stroke at the age of 88.
After one last celebration of Easter, the most joyous day on the Christian calendar.
One final blessing of the faithful from the balcony, the same balcony where he introduced himself to the world in March of 2013.
His funeral will be held in St. Peter's Square. President and Mrs. Trump will lead the U.S. delegation.
Burial will not be in St. Peter's Basilica, but at the Pope's request, at the papal Basilica of St. Mary Major, reflecting Francis's special devotion to the Blessed Mother.
And then in early May, the cardinals will meet to choose his successor. Seth Doan begins our coverage tonight from Rome. Seth?
The week leading up to Easter is the most important and one of the busiest times for the Pope. But Pope Francis did not heed his doctor's warnings to rest and to stay away from crowds. Rather, he was where he loved to be most, surrounded by people. Bells tolling to mark the passing of a pope is a practice dating back to the Middle Ages. Today they honored a church leader who very much broke with tradition. It set a somber tone in St. Peter's Square as we saw how the startling news was settling in. The Monday after Easter is a holiday here in Italy, and many have come out here to the center of the Catholic Church to pay their respects to the people's Pope.
I mean, this is where he lived. This is, the Vatican is the symbol of the Catholic Church.
Sanchita Loba lives in Rome and could only think to bring her family, even the dog, to be as close as they could. You didn't know the Pope, but no. It seems like
I knew the Pope. He lived in a simple place. He wore simple clothes. He chose not to be in fancy cars. Those things was really a fine example of what today's Catholic should be like.
He was a pope of the people, the people's pope.
John Allen is the editor of Crux, a news site specializing in the Vatican. He says it was remarkable to see Francis on Easter Sunday after that 38-day hospitalization with double pneumonia. Regardless of what doctors said, stay away from big crowds, that didn't happen.
Look, to paraphrase Frank Sinatra, he did it his way. And his way was not to remain under wraps.
Americans Teddy Boutinis and Lindsay Datis are studying abroad in Florence and learned the news on the train to Rome this morning.
You know, there's definitely an aura. It's peaceful and it's joyous, even though it's a really sad thing. I think there's just like a really light energy, and I think there's a reason for that.
Many remarked just how different these scenes were from those on Easter Sunday.
I mean, at the time, we thought this was the Pope's triumphant comeback. It turned out, of course, to be his swan song.
Yusuf Chadid from Lebanon noted the cross-section of cultures represented in the church.
But also to be part of it, because we are part of the people for which Pope Francis always asked to pray for him. So we are kind of giving back to him what he just gave us.
As is tradition, the official residence of the Pope was sealed today, another ritual of many to come in this papal transition, a transition which, when he waved to crowds on Easter, no one would expect to happen so soon.
Seth, what do we expect in the coming days, and how will it depart from tradition?
Well, we've seen, John, this was a pope who underlined simplicity through his entire papacy and how he was driven around in the clothes that he wore. And now we see it will also affect how he will be buried and his final wishes. We expect it to be a much more simple coffin, a closed coffin. That coffin is expected to be brought to St. Peter's Basilica in the middle of the week, likely on Wednesday. And he will depart from tradition with all other popes had their title Pope on their tomb. He will have simply Franciscus.
Seth Doan for us in Rome. Thank you, Seth.
Our Norah O'Donnell is the only American network television correspondent to interview Pope Francis.
She met with him at the Vatican in May of last year.
Do you like when you are called the people's pope?
El Papa de la gente.
The Pope of the people? I've always been a pastor.
Fui pastor siempre.
You are a pastor for the people, not for yourself. A pastor has to be for the people.
Pope Francis was born Jorge Mario Bergoglio in Argentina in 1936 into a family of Italian immigrants. Bergoglio was on his way to a party when he passed a church and felt compelled to go to confession. That moment led him to the priesthood. Decades later, he became Archbishop of Buenos Aires with a focus on the poor. And in 2001, Pope St. John Paul II elevated him to cardinal. As Pope for 12 years, Francis was known for his humility. He stuck to church doctrine, but extended his hand to those he felt were marginalized, especially migrants and the LGBTQ community.
You have said, who am I to judge? Homosexuality is not a crime.
No, it's a human fact.
There are conservative bishops in the United States that oppose your new efforts to revisit teachings and traditions. How do you address their criticism?
You used an adjective, conservative. That is, conservative is one who clings to something and does not want to see beyond that. It is a suicidal attitude. Because one thing is to take tradition into account, to consider situations from the past, but quite another is to be closed up inside a dogmatic box.
What do you hope your legacy is?
I never really thought about it. The church is the legacy. The church not only through the Pope, but through you, through every Christian, through everyone. Personally, I get on the bandwagon of the church and its legacy for all.
Norah joins us, and I never get tired of watching this interview. So why do you think he decided to sit down with you?
Well, this interview was almost exactly 1 year ago, and it surrounded the Vatican's first World Children's Day, something incredibly important to Pope Francis. You know, the Holy Father has used his papacy to focus on children, what world is being left for them, whether that is for migrant children, climate change, or issues of war and peace. So in many ways, it was a reset for the church, which has been beset by the child sex abuse scandal. And in our interview, he talked about the reforms and the zero tolerance for any abuse within the church.
Norah, you spent so much time with him. What surprised you about your time with the Holy Father?
I was surprised by his warmth, his graciousness. He gave us an hour of his time for this wide-ranging conversation. I mean, popes don't give interviews, but he answered all of our tough questions about doctrines. And one of my favorite parts was when I asked him if he likes being called the people's pope. And he had this huge smile on his mouth. And I think that's exactly what he wants his legacy to be, this pastoral outreach and a legacy of inclusiveness.
Norah O'Donnell on her extraordinary interview. Thank you, Norah.
Thank you.
Cardinals from around the world will soon be heading to Rome for the Pope's funeral and to choose his successor. The date for the funeral and the conclave have not yet been announced.
Among those cardinals is Timothy Dolan, the Archbishop of New York. He shared his thoughts with me today about Francis.
This morning when I heard the news, when I went into my chapel to pray for him, what was I thinking of? He called me when my mom died. He called me the second week into COVID and said, how's New York doing? He called me on October 7th and he said, how are my Jewish friends in New York doing? These are the things that move you. There's sort of a communal fascination and affection for him. You kind of expect it among Catholics, but when you see it outside, you're thinking, wow, the impact this man had. People felt hugged by him.
When you talk about that, people of other faiths coming up to you and expressing those deep condolences, not superficial ones, why do you think that is?
I remember his first Sunday in Rome after he was Pope. And what did he speak about? He spoke about tenderness. To hear the Pope speak about tenderness, mercy, compassion, love. This is what moved us about him.
Is that his legacy?
You know how when you read the Gospels, Jesus seemed to have X-ray vision for the people at the side of the road. You know, he'd be surrounded by crowds, but he could always, oh, there's the woman who's suffering. Pope Francis almost had like a radar for people who were left behind at the side of the road. I could see his eyes when he'd see the baby. I could see his eyes when he would see somebody who was maybe bent over and crippled at the side, right over there. I'd say that's a legacy that was contagious and is going to stick with us.
I love that idea of radar, but Cardinal Dolan's a jolly guy. Did he ever talk about the Pope's humor?
He sure did. It wasn't all about just humility and spirituality. He described the time they were at an event and there was a circus act. A couple guys were swallowing swords. He said, "Holy Father, I'm not swallowing a sword." And the Holy Father looked at his stomach and said, "That's about the only thing you're not swallowing." So it was that way behind closed doors as well.
That's great. The flag at the White House was lowered today to half-staff in honor of the Pope. At churches around the country, mourners left flowers, lit candles, and offered prayers for Francis. Janet Shamlian has tonight's Eye on America from one of the largest and fastest-growing dioceses in the U.S.
The church bells rang in downtown Houston as Catholics, with hearts both heavy and grateful, came for comfort. At the Co-Cathedral of the Sacred Heart, parishioners mourned a pope they never met, but always felt close to.
I am here to commemorate our Pope's wonderful life. He has been a changer in the Catholic Church.
June Barth is a lifelong Catholic.
How has he changed the Church? He has gone away from all the conservative ways, and he's more of a people person. He's reached out to the poor, the handicapped, the lonely.
More than 7 million Catholics live in Texas. The Houston-Galveston Diocese is the nation's 5th largest and arguably its most diverse. Mass is offered in 14 languages.
How do you comfort such a diverse population?
With the gospel. And so we just, this last 4 days, celebrated in 3 languages in this building that I was present with, just in this community alone.
On the day of his death, many of the faithful are considering his life, one marked by his unshakable commitment to humility and inclusion, values that mirror their own.
Did you feel a connection to him personally?
Pope Francis, he took that name for a reason, to help the poor, to be with the children, and I think that touched me. He led a very humble life.
1 in 5 American adults describe themselves as Catholic, some 53 million people. A strong majority, 78%, viewed Pope Francis favorably.
So you stood behind the doctrines he supported?
Not 100%, but at the end of the day, he is the Pope.
One of those stances that made him a polarizing figure, especially here in Texas, immigration.
We're an immigrant country, and we should realize that everybody is our brother and our sister.
Tonight in churches like this, where belief is expressed in multiple languages, the loss of a pope is a death in the family.
We pray for the repose of the soul of our Holy Father, Pope Francis.
And the sorrow, like the faith, runs deep. For Eye on America, I'm Janet Shamlian in Houston.
The Pope is not only the leader of the world's Catholics, he is also the Bishop of Rome.
And that is where Chris Livesay went, in search of Francis.
To understand Pope Francis, you have to come down here to street level. That's where we went with Father Enzo Fortunato.
I think the Holy Father is very linked with these people.
Buonasera, brava gente. The Franciscan friar was a close personal aide to Pope Francis. He was with him yesterday, just hours before he died. Papa. And he ran into him inside St. Peter's Basilica on Saturday.
Did that surprise you when you saw Pope Francis? And
yeah, surprised, very surprised. Pope Francis is a man of surprise.
It was hardly his first surprise appearance. Only a week and a half ago, he was spotted wearing little more than a poncho with his head uncovered.
Pope Francis was very tenderness, no, tenero.
He was tender.
Tender, no? Without the sign of the power.
But in the end, it was Francis who called the shots. Easter was a day too holy to miss. And Pope Francis, Father Enzo told me, wanted to die with his boots on.
So Pope Francis gave his life just like Jesus.
Until the very end.
Until the very end, yes. This is love. I think Pope Francis love.
Chris Livesay, CBS News, Rome.
Today begins a period of mourning for the world's roughly 1.3 billion Roman Catholics as they remember and honor the life and service of Pope Francis. He died Monday morning, just hours after making a surprise appearance in St. Peter's Square to mark Easter Sunday. Foreign correspondent Chris Livesay joins me now. Chris, tell me what you're hearing from there in Rome as everybody gathers to mourn the Pope.
I can tell you one of the most dramatic things I heard, John, was the tolling of the bells here behind me in St. Peter's Square. 88 times they rang out for Pope Francis, who was 88 years old when he died. Now, tributes have been pouring out as well. People were flooding to St. Peter's Square for a praying of the rosary earlier this evening. I spoke to one woman from New York City there. She had actually come this morning hoping to see Pope Francis when he was still alive and got off the plane only to find out that he had died. Here's what she told me.
So his legacy, he reached out to the poorest among the poor, and then the people that far away. He's the person that reaches out to people, that regardless of who you are, what color you are, we are all one in spirit and in faith.
Chris, what are we expecting over the next few days as these ceremonies continue?
Well, the burial process and everything that comes has already begun. He was placed inside of a casket this evening around 8 o'clock local time. He'll now be buried within the next 4 to 6 days. But then the big event is the conclave, John. That's when cardinals descend upon Rome from all corners of the earth to elect the next pope. That's going to happen within the next 15 to 20 days. John, it'll be nothing short of historic.
And Chris, are there preparations that you can just see physically to manage all of the people who will be coming, all of the traffic, just the flows of this enormous collection of humans?
Well, they've already started to block off streets around St. Peter's Square and around the Vatican. I mean, we could see just floods and floods of people heading towards St. Peter's Square this morning when I rushed here and I heard the news of Pope Francis's death. It was just stunning to see not just so many people crowding here, but just how quiet it was. There was a deafening silence. The solemn nature of it all was overwhelming.
When Pope Francis first appeared after his election in 2013, he did so in a simple white cassock with a wooden cross, a toned-down symbolic choice befitting the first Jesuit pope from an order of the church whose members take a vow of poverty. Francis was also the first pope from Latin America, celebrated for his humility and love for the people. Joining me now is James Grimaldi, executive editor of the National Catholic Reporter. James, thanks so much for being with us. In 5 years, in 10 years, what will people say about the time as pope for Pope Francis?
Well, I think he'll be remembered as the Pope who reached out to the margins of the world and the margins of the church. He really cared about migrants, the poor. As you mentioned, he was a humble man. He took on that humble look like St. Francis of Assisi, who he took his name Francis from, whose care for the poor was well known among the Catholic Church. But he also outreached, when I talk about people on the margins, those who might not have felt welcome in the church before. He had a big, basically, ministry for LGBTQ Catholics. He did a lot to promote women in the church in terms of their leadership abilities, putting them in very key roles in the Vatican, and really fighting very hard on the point of protecting migrants, to the point that he got into spats with the Trump administration over its current immigration policy.
James, is it possible to help me to put those achievements you just discussed with respect to Pope Francis and put them on a spectrum within the Catholic Church? We hear so much about conservative, liberal, all the rest. Can you just help us understand the spectrum a little bit?
Yeah, sure, and there are nuances. It is complicated, and I've been a practicing Catholic all my life and still trying to figure it out. But I will say that he's seen as being someone who is really considered in the progressive side. That's sort of his image and his persona, which is why our readers at ncronline.org, the National Catholic Reporter, love Pope Francis. He was not so loved, frankly, by many who are considered conservative traditional Catholics, but the truth is, when it comes down to it, while he wanted to reach out to these margins and bring in all of these various constituencies, he never really actually changed the doctrine. The doctrine is essentially the same on abortion, on gay marriage, on women priests. As Nora O'Donnell broke the big story during the Synod on Synodality in the interview with Pope Francis, in which he said there won't be women priests in his papacy. So it is a nuance. It may be sort of more of a tone, really, than it is in terms of changing the lyrics. But it was huge. I think it will be how he's remembered. And also, after a lot of this, he followed Pope Benedict, but he was very big on the environment. Something else I should have mentioned, that his Laudato Si encyclical was groundbreaking.
We have about 30 seconds. A moment from his life that is most memorable to you.
Well, I have to agree, I think, with Vice President J.D. Vance, and it would be that address he gave, the homily he gave during COVID-19, when he went out there on that stage in a completely empty and vacant St. Peter's Square. I mean, it was something that gives me chills still to this day when I see it, and it was a beautiful message of reconnecting with God and telling us, yes, we would survive this. It was almost like Hollywood staged that, and that will stick with me. The other thing, maybe when he first came out onto the balcony in the loggia in St. Peter's Square, the first Jesuit Pope. I was baptized by a Jesuit. I went to a Jesuit school. My son goes to a Jesuit university, and we love Jesuits. So.
The final goodbyes have begun for Pope Francis. Vatican residents and members of the papal household filed past his coffin in a guest house adjacent to the Vatican.
That was a private viewing. The Pope will be moved tomorrow to St. Peter's Basilica, where the public can pay respects before his funeral on Saturday.
Members of the College of Cardinals will meet next month behind the locked doors of the Sistine Chapel to choose a new pope, but they've already begun consulting one another. Seth Doan is in Rome tonight. Seth.
Cardinals are indeed coming from all over the world, of course, to mourn Pope Francis, but also really to start looking forward. And as you note, some of that work to select the next pope happens well before the conclave begins. It was clear where they were going this morning. Cardinals in their red cap or zucchetto, conspicuous even on the streets of Rome. Today was the first in a series of secret meetings they'll hold, with the direction of the church at stake. We saw the opening prayer, but little else, only learning that Pope Francis's funeral was set for Saturday. We are heading to meet the editorial director of the Vatican Department of Communications. All of the Vatican communications, radio, web, television, come through him.
During all his life and when I met him, I think that one idea of his life is to be normal.
Francis's desire for normalcy, Andrea Tornielli says, is reflected in his wish for a more simplified coffin, burial, and tomb. Seeing those pictures of the Pope in his coffin, some of them seem quite raw. I wondered, is that something that he said, show it like it is?
For the faithful, it's important also to see the body of the Pope as the body of a relative that we loved. It's also a sign, I think, of our life and what's happening just after our death.
From tomorrow, the public will get a chance to pay respects to a pope who centered his ministry on themes of mercy, compassion, and peace.
His legacy is a church with open doors. Pope Francis didn't change doctrine, but change an attitude, especially to poor people, people who are suffering, immigrants, and so on.
if he didn't change doctrine but changed tone, does that last in the long term?
I think, yes, each reform starts in the heart of a man.
And Seth Doane joins us now. Seth, a lot of people have watched the movie Conclave, and that may be informing their view of the way this is going to happen. Set us straight. Is that the way it goes down?
Interestingly, John, that movie came up in the interview with that Vatican official, and he said, you really can't look at this through a political lens, or what he said were human categories. He said, what you should look at here is the time frame of all this, how remarkable it is in his case. He says to see cardinals coming from all over the world, different traditions, different languages, deciding on a pope in a relatively short time frame. Of course, some of that backroom dealing, that king-making, is happening in these meetings right now. He says, though, it is not like you see in the movies.
And Seth, because the Pope elevated 4/5 of the current voting cardinals, does that give us any kind of insight into how they may choose?
In short, no, Maurice. That is the real question. Pope Francis really tried to elevate cardinals from different parts of the world, unknown church leaders, and part of that is not knowing how they might vote. So that is the wild card.
Seth Doane for us in Rome. Thank you so much, Seth.
And among those at the private viewing of the Pope was our Nora O'Donnell.
We just came from paying our respects to Pope Francis. It was a very intimate moment inside his home at Casa Santa Marta. We were invited, and we were there with nuns, priests, and people who know the Holy Father well. It was a deeply moving and spiritual experience as we stood just feet away from the body of Pope Francis. It was silent inside except for the whisper of prayers. One little girl cried as she left, and some of the people who were there to say goodbye actually touched Pope Francis's open casket. We got this prayer card as we left. The emotion of it all, a reminder of just how much Pope Francis means to the faithful.
We're learning more details about the funeral for Pope Francis, which is set for this weekend. Starting tomorrow, mourners will be able to visit the Pope as he lies in state at St. Peter's Basilica. For the latest, foreign correspondent Chris Livesay joins me now from Rome. Chris, tell me, what have we learned about the Pope's final moments?
Well, we know, John, that he said thank you to his private nurse. Those were some of his last words, according to the Vatican. Specifically, he was thanking his nurse, the same person who was at his bedside when he was in the hospital for double pneumonia and when he was back home recovering from that illness. He thanked him for getting him back to the square here behind me in St. Peter's on Easter, and for getting to take what turned out to be that final ride in the Pope Mobile. The Vatican then says that he went to bed, and the next morning at around 5:30, he was struck with an illness. He was able to gesture goodbye to that same nurse before falling into a coma, and then he died. Now, we've also seen his last will and testament, which specifies exactly how and where he would like to be buried, not here behind me in St. Peter's Basilica, but outside the Vatican in St. Mary Major. He made it clear he wants no lavish tomb. He doesn't even want it to specify that he was a pope. He simply wants his tomb to say Francis or Franciscus in the Latin. John.
Chris, what are we learning about the next few days between basically now and the service on Saturday?
Well, for the city of Rome, it's going to be an organizational nightmare. If you think back to 2005, when John Paul II passed away, there were some 2 million people in this square behind me. I've talked to people who were here at the time, and they say they couldn't even walk around the square. They couldn't even leave the convent that I'm broadcasting from because people were packed so tightly into the streets. Many of them were sleeping out in the open. So we don't know exactly how many people are going to be at Pope Francis's funeral, but we do know who some of them are going to be. It's going to be heads of state from all around the world, none other than Donald Trump. You have the president of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky. The center of the universe, practically, John, is going to be right here in Rome.
The body of Pope Francis went on public view today in St. Peter's Basilica. People will be able to pay respects for the next 2 days until his funeral in the square on Saturday. And they are lining up by the thousands. Seth Doane is in Rome.
in a procession somehow both grand and deeply personal. The body of Pope Francis was carried through St. Peter's Square, the stage he commanded for the last 12 years. Then pallbearers brought the coffin into the 16th century basilica this morning so the public could start to say their farewell. Among them, Sarah Borchers from Cincinnati, Ohio.
Can you describe your feeling when you were inside?
It was a little bit overwhelming, honestly. Just a hushed kind of sense of respect. This is the first pope that I've really felt a connection to, and I think it's because of the work that he has done, particularly to support, the poor, the hungry.
She waited with her family for 5 hours, along with tens of thousands of others.
Lines are now extending around St. Peter's Basilica as the faithful line up to pay their respects to Pope Francis. We're going to get a chance to go in as well.
Inside, the closer you get, the masses around you almost seem to disappear as each takes their own moment to reflect. Rasha Flum Gabor came even though she's not Catholic.
Why do you feel so close to this Pope?
Because he's not only Pope for the Roman Catholic, but he's the Pope for all.
We're now witnessing those final moments where Pope Francis is dominating this space one final time.
John Allen, the editor of Crux, a news site specializing in the Vatican, says this pageantry for Francis, that always humble Pope, is a reminder of the millennia-old tradition of the Church.
When you look at these images, it doesn't seem scaled back.
It's really hard to use terms such as scaled back or modest to talking about an event that is going to draw a cavalcade of VIPs from around the world. While there are humble touches, let us not forget that the papacy is an absolutely singular office on the global stage. Yes, the Pope is the leader of 1.3 billion Roman Catholics around the world, but he is also, in a very real sense, the leader of all people of faith, and for that matter, all people of conscience everywhere in the world.
And Seth Jones joins us now from just outside the Vatican. Seth, I was there 20 years ago when John Paul was laid to rest. I was struck by the awe, the silence of the moment as the people lined up. What struck you today?
Absolutely, Maurice. It was that same thing, just that everything seems to kind of fade away around you. Some of the most raw moments of emotion I've seen to date in covering this story have been those moments just as people turned away from the casket. We were not allowed to shoot interviews there in the Basilica out of respect, but I did notice this one woman who, with tears in her eyes, was kind of covering her face, and I went up to her. We had a conversation in Italian. I said, "What's touching you so much?" She said, "This Pope was like us. He was humble. He was poor. I felt like I knew him." She said, "I'm worried about the world. I wonder about the direction of the Church, and I'll miss Francis."
Finally tonight, Pope Francis was a lifelong fan of the beautiful game, what we Americans call soccer. He started playing when he was called Jorge Bergoglio as a kid growing up in Argentina. He admitted he wasn't very good. His nickname was Hardfoot. Bergoglio followed the Argentine club San Lorenzo. Didn't watch them on television. He swore off TV decades ago in a promise to the Virgin of Carmen for reasons that remained between them. Instead, he listened on the radio until he became Pope, when the Swiss Guards took on the task of keeping him up on the scores. Francis admired Argentine soccer star Lionel Messi, but his favorite was Pelé. He said the Brazilian had perseverance, stability, and temperance, all Christian values, the Pope noted. This week, San Lorenzo remembered their biggest fan in the team chapel. Their new stadium will be named in his honor. And do you believe in miracles? This is the Pope's San Lorenzo club membership card, number 88235. 88 was his age when he died Monday morning at 2:35. Thousands of mourners have streamed through St. Peter's Basilica to pay their final respects to Pope Francis. CBS's Chris Livesay has been watching the faithful pay their personal tributes. He joins me now overlooking St. Peter's Square. And Chris, I don't know if there's any ritual on earth that's like this. What's it been like? What have you experienced and seen?
Well, I can tell you, Maurice, what I'm seeing literally right now, and that is people just jam-packed inside and outside of the square, lining up to catch a glimpse of Pope Francis. According to the Vatican earlier today, already 20,000 people had lined up to see him, but now I'm seeing even more people lined up than before. Once they actually get to see Pope Francis, they're seeing a lot of change, and that's because Pope Francis changed the rules of a papal burial before he died. So previous popes were buried inside of 3 elaborate nested coffins. Pope Francis is just buried inside of 1 coffin made out of wood. And right now you can see that coffin inside of the basilica behind me, and it's on the ground. Gone is this pedestal that used to raise it into the air. Pope Francis wanted to be down to earth, and it's just tilted a little bit towards the pews and towards the people who are coming in to see him.
Chris, I'm wondering if anybody's reacted to that, the more humble way of Pope Francis, the simplicity of it all. What are people saying about that?
Well, it certainly reflects the life of Pope Francis and the character as he lived. You know, he drove around in a very modest Fiat 500 car most of the time. He wasn't being chauffeured around in a limousine, and that nature is going to be reflected in his burial as well. Not here in St. Peter's Basilica, where he's currently lying in state, but 2 miles east of here, beyond the Vatican walls, inside of St. Mary Major Basilica. It was his favorite church in Rome. He prayed there before and after every one of his global journeys. It was a sign of his simplicity, and on his tomb, it won't even mention that he's a pope. He wanted it to just have one word on it, his name, Francis.
Good evening, I'm Maurice Dubois. John Dickerson is in Rome, and at this hour, mourners are filing past the coffin of Pope Francis inside St. Peter's Basilica. Since the viewing began yesterday, the line has been so long, the doors are being kept open well past the scheduled midnight closing. The Basilica shut down for only an hour early this morning for cleaning. Cardinals from around the world continue to arrive. They will be meeting next month to choose a new pope. And John, they say all roads lead to Rome, and it looks like at least one of them begins in New York.
Indeed, Maurice. We traveled more than 4,000 miles to Rome and wound up bumping into the priest from around the block. It's a small world drawn closer by Pope Francis, and for the church to thrive, it has to stay that way. As Catholics and the curious from around the world converged on Rome, we stopped by St. Patrick's Catholic American Parish to talk to the rector, who looked familiar.
Welcome to St. Patrick's. Come on in.
We were bonding over the choir at St. Paul the Apostle in New York City. Do you recognize this song? Where he had been a priest, my priest, for 3 years. Now Father Matt Barrios is watching the church he loves turn a page. What are you looking for in the next pope?
A shepherd, first and foremost. A man that can listen, a man that can lead, but a man that knows how to be humble.
Why is humility so important?
Because that is a pure imitation of Jesus. Being a leader is not about vaunting yourself. It's not about putting your name on buildings and proclaiming yourself. It's about putting yourself in love at the service and care of others, especially of the most vulnerable.
Sounds like your description of Pope Francis.
Absolutely.
The shepherd must smell like the sheep, Pope Francis said, and all day long the flock has gathered as bells pealed, the rain fell, to celebrate his push to put his life, his office, and his church among the people. Not everyone embraced Francis's style, yet in a church short on priests and losing parishioners, his authenticity, his joy, his humility wasn't just holy, says Father Matt, it was necessary. Does the church have to find a balance that allows it to be more accessible for people in a modern world?
I think so. It's trying to find the fundamental proclamation of faith and proclaim it in a way that is in the language of the everyday person, spoken in the language of the culture.
Some people we spoke with here say Pope Francis made the church feel close. So close he could call himself the world's parish priest. The task for the church now? Finding a pope who nurtures that same feeling. where it's possible to run into your neighborhood priest in Rome and have it feel like more than a coincidence.
What a moment there, John. 20 years ago for John Paul's funeral, I remember walking along the incredibly long lines of people extending way out into the streets and how quiet and reverent people were. What are you seeing this time around?
It is exactly that, Maurice. Over my shoulder is a mass of people quietly moving through the cordons. In there, it's so brightly lit, you expect some kind of an event, a show, a sporting match or something, and it is so quiet. I mean, you can almost hear the heels beating on the travertine stone. Everyone is orderly, and they're going to be there for hours on the way to spend just a few seconds with Pope Francis. Welcome back to Rome. In 3 separate conversations I had today with a cardinal, an archbishop, and a priest, the comparison to American politics came up when talking about how the next pope will be chosen. But there is a significant difference between the two systems. In American politics, candidates boast. Flash and hubris often win. In the conclave, those same traits are liabilities. As Colleen Dully, Vatican reporter for America magazine, explained to me, he who enters a conclave a pope exits a cardinal, meaning if any cardinal campaigns too openly for the job, his chances diminish. That same suspicion of ambition shaped the early American presidency. George Washington didn't campaign, nor did many of the first American presidents. It was believed that gross ambition was a cancer. So maybe the systems aren't that different. Both are shaped, at least in their ideal, by a common fear that the person who most wants power may be the last person who should have it.
Thousands continue to pay tribute to Pope Francis as he lies in state in St. Peter's Basilica. John Dickerson is in Rome to cover Saturday's funeral, and for tonight's interview, he spoke with Father Matthew Berrios, who leads St. Patrick's Catholic American Parish, and asked him about the legacy Francis leaves behind.
Let's talk about the moment you heard that Pope Francis had passed. Where were you, and how did you receive that news?
It must have been somewhere around 9 o'clock in the morning. I was having coffee in the living room, finished with morning prayer, and the vice rector, Father Greg Appersell, sent me a text just very simply saying the Holy Father died. It was a little surreal, I suppose, and so I had to check the New York Times and a couple of other outlets just to see if that was in fact true, because living here, you hear all sorts of things. As a priest friend of mine said, Roman gossip is the best gossip. Sometimes it's even true, so you have to double check your sources. But no, it was very shocking. We had expected it for a while. We didn't expect that it would happen so suddenly.
He was the Pope for most of the time that for the time that you've been a priest, he's mostly been your Pope, yeah?
He has been Pope for the majority of my time as a religious. I think I was only in seminary for maybe 2 or 3 years when he was elected. And so for most of my life as a Paulist, I've only known Francis.
Did you see any evidence that Pope Francis brought people either back into the Catholic Church who had lapsed, or people who were not religious but came through his more public persona?
I think, yes, absolutely. People were able to come back to the church if they had felt alienated, precisely because he was willing to have the tough conversations with peoples and person groups that maybe many people in the church had ignored or outright disparaged. There was nothing to be afraid of in engaging and welcoming and trying to have a certain accoglienza towards the rest of the world. Even those who aren't religious felt a certain warmth and friendliness and fondness towards him.
As I think about people joining the church, why did you join the priesthood?
Well, the simple answer is because I was called, but what the call feels like is a little nebulous. In some ways, it's like an attraction. It's like gravity. It's almost like falling in love with the call of a certain style of life and a certain way of prayer and a certain way of being.
What does the Catholic Church need to do to recruit more priests?
Well, what makes priesthood attractive to young people, I think, is those who are currently priests living their priesthood joyfully. Because that's a beautiful and attractive thing when you find someone who's so fallen in love with the life that they've been called to that it flowers and becomes a place of grace and inspiration for others around them.
We live in a time where a lot of people in different countries all over the world believe in a different thing. Latest and loudest, largest, biggest. How does that create an appetite for the case for humility that you just made? Or does it make it more difficult to preach humility in a world where if it's not flashy and gold-plated, it doesn't count?
The faith becomes a sign of contradiction in that way, and it's not necessarily something bad, because the church at one level will always be countercultural. No matter what the current trends of culture might be, the church will always have something to proclaim, and if we live it authentically, it'll be something attractive. It'll be something beautiful because it's living. It comes from our groundedness in God, to His life and love itself.
Living it authentically sounds like your description of Pope Francis.
Absolutely.
Back now in Rome, where 250,000 people paid their respects to Pope Francis over the past 3 days. When the sun comes up, St. Peter's Square will be filled with mourners as Romans say goodbye to their bishop and the world to their pope. As Pope Francis's coffin was sealed, the city of Rome shut down. Ahead of his funeral, streets, shops, even the airspace above were closed. St. Peter's Square, filled for days with winding lines of pilgrims, was empty, having left those who had visited, like members of this Buffalo, New York parish, in awe. What will you carry back to Buffalo with you?
I feel like I'm a different person already. And there's more learning, there's more awakening inside. It's almost surreal, but I feel empowered in my faith.
Pope Francis's funeral mass will end here at the Basilica of St. Mary Major, where he prayed regularly to the Mother of Jesus and an icon that Romans refer to as the protector of the Roman people. Many in Rome describe Pope Francis as a protector.
He made himself so visible to say, I am here with you, with everyone who's hurting, anyone who needs that presence of all the church to be present.
Among those paying tribute, Sister Norma Pimentel, a Mexican-American nun and the executive director of Catholic Charities of the Rio Grande. Praised by Francis for her work with migrants, she remembers the first time the Pope asked to meet with her.
The very first time that he actually called me out and wanted to meet me, it's like, and show that face in his eyes and his joy and his smile. It was, I don't know I can only explain it with almost as if heaven comes down and embraces me with his presence,
Who are you here as the representative of?
Of everyone that acknowledges us and knows. Back home, there's thousands of people that are joined with me and would love to have been here this moment. When I knelt before his casket and I just started to cry, we were all there together in that moment.
Would he want you to be joyful?
I definitely think so, yes. That's what he was. When I think of him, I close my eyes and I see his face, I see joy.
John, you and I spoke earlier today about taking the journey from the Vatican to St. Mary Major. Really interesting journey. I want you to see if you could describe that for our audience.
Sure. We processed by Pope Francis, and the Basilica at St. Peter's draws your eyes to the heavens. There is so much to look at there, and everyone in the Basilica was looking at the coffin of Francis. And you also had the kneeling by at every level of clergy, kneeling and praying. Then, and let's call up a map here, this is the route that will tomorrow, where Pope Francis will be driven to the Basilica of St. Mary Major, and we essentially drove that route. And when we got there, you saw in the piece there was that banner that said, "Thank you, Francis," and that was hung across from the Basilica, and that was a crucial place for him. He visited there after he was made Pope, and whenever he would travel, he would go there and he would pray before and after. And it is outside the city walls of Rome among the people. And that, of course, is consistent with his entire papacy and, of course, his life.
Moving moments for all who were there, no doubt. Do we have any sense, John, of when the conclave is actually going to begin?
I ran into a cardinal inside the Basilica of St. Peter's, and he said that they won't announce a date or vote on a date until after the funeral. Everyone is still focused on Francis, even though they're talking about his replacement. It would be unseemly to move on to that next stage without first engaging fully in the funeral and the celebration of his life. When Cardinal Bergoglio was elected Pope here 12 years ago, he took the name Francis after Francis of Assisi because of the saint's devotion to the poor, a devotion shared by the Pope and by the chef Steve Hartman met on the road.
Back in 2017, when Bruno Serrato returned to his White House restaurant in Anaheim, California, after it had burned in a fire, there was virtually nothing left worth saving, except this crucifix, gifted from Pope Francis himself and found by a firefighter, glistening in the ash.
Here it come up. I was like, no way. This is a sign of God, for sure. There's no doubt about it. Buon appetito. Enjoy your dinner.
I'd first met Bruno 7 years earlier. The Italian immigrant was serving meals to the rich and famous.
Are you hungry?
Just so he could feed the down and out.
It's yours.
Using the proceeds from his restaurant, Bruno treated the kids at the local Boys and Girls Club to a fine dining experience. Every night he did this. Later, he expanded his charity.
Is it cool?
To feed and house the homeless. Over the years, he has helped hundreds of thousands of people. And Bruno says what has kept him going through the fire, the rebuilding, and all the financial strain was Pope Francis, who he met 4 times. On the last visit, Pope Francis told him this.
Bravo, bravo, continua così. That means keep doing what you do. Here I am, open up, and doing more and more than what I ever done before in my entire life.
The legacy of any leader, whether pope or president, preacher or teacher, is measured not just by what they do, but rather who they inspire. Pope Francis made the poor his priority. And here in America, in this man, that legacy will live on.
Yeah, I have to keep doing what I'm doing. If I don't, it come down.
Steve Hartman, CBS News, on the road.
Now to the funeral for Pope Francis. The Vatican says about 250,000 mourners paid tribute to the Pope over the past 3 days of public viewing at St. Peter's Basilica. Tomorrow, the faithful flock will be joined by world leaders as he will be laid to rest. CBS's Chris Livesay is there, overlooking the Vatican with the latest tonight.
Well, the funeral of Pope Francis is nearly upon us. Now, it will take place in the exact same place where Pope Francis made his final appearance less than a week ago on Easter Sunday. Remember, that was an event that was not scheduled to happen. The 88-year-old defying doctors' orders to stay at home and rest as he continued to recover from pneumonia. But those closest to Pope Francis tell us this was a man who wanted to die with his boots on, among the people. Now, papal funerals are usually full of pomp and pageantry, but Francis hated those things and toned down the rituals before he died. So gone are the 3 nested coffins of previous popes. Francis will be buried in just one, a simple wooden coffin. And he won't be buried here in St. Peter's, but 2 miles outside the Vatican. Much like in his papacy, he never missed an opportunity to leave these walls. He'll be laid to rest in the Basilica of St. Mary Major, his favorite church in Rome, inside a tomb that won't even mention he was a pope, just his name, Franciscus. Now, to get here, a procession will take his body through the heart of Rome, through the Roman Forum, and past the Colosseum. Security has been beefed up with road closures, heightened police presence, and jammers for drones. It's what you'd expect when the guests are a who's who of world leaders and dignitaries, from President Donald Trump to Prince William. And we've also learned that former President Joe Biden, a devout Catholic, will also be there. For one day, the Eternal City will be at the center of the world. Maurice?
Chris Lipsey in Rome, thank you. And please join us for live coverage of the funeral for Pope Francis tomorrow morning, extra early, 3:45 a.m. Eastern, 12:45 a.m. Pacific on CBS and on Paramount+.
Live for your eulogy, not your resume. It's a secular piece of advice, but it works on the same principle as the religious tradition. There's a big evaluation at the end of your days, and you want to have some things lined up for it. A pope has these 2 aspects of life in sync. One of the stray thoughts that presents itself when you spend days talking to people about his life. In Rome, talking to people about Pope Francis, you become a kind of collector of eulogies. People who never met him, speaking about him as if they had. Humility, grace, love. It's as if they all received the same memo, but each one thinks they wrote it themselves, because somehow Francis made them feel that deeply. The phrase "the people's pope" has been used quite a lot. When it comes from the mouths of the pilgrims who have come here, it makes sense, feels new again. What did he do with his days? A moral compass for the world, a guide in the lonesome hours for the suffering, a reminder of the poor and the left behind, and somehow, too, a purveyor of joy. That's the eulogy being written now in the patient footsteps across travertine marble into St. Peter's, in the murmured prayers by his coffin there, in the quiet sobs of the woman ahead of us in line. We followed Francis's final journey ourselves today to the Basilica of St. Mary Major, where he will be laid to rest, outside the city walls in the church where he often prayed. Across the street, someone had hung a sign across 4 windows, a simple eulogy written without speeches or ceremony. It read, "Grazie, Francesco." Thank you, Francis. And that's tonight's CBS Evening News Plus. I'm John Dickerson in Rome. Be sure to join us tomorrow morning for live coverage of the funeral of Pope Francis. Good night.